Today, Burnout Economics is why you feel so poor. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, World Notice Post covering finance and property news. Friday again, Tarric's back for another chat. Tarric, welcome back. How are you going?
Yeah, not too bad, mate. All things considered. How about you?
Yeah, pretty good. I know it's pretty warm down there at the moment. Everyone's complaining about the heat. The economy is looking, no, according to Jim, everything's fine. I call him Spin Jim these days because he's very selective in the information he actually produces, isn't he?
It's a little bit disappointing, isn't it? I remember in the days of the Morrison government that Jim used to be quite keen on things like per capita, per capita GDP, per capita household living standards and all these different things. And these days he's just not that keen on it anymore, or, different perspectives on things like real wages. It's just all spin these days. And that's a little bit disappointing. I think that there was quite a few people out there, even some senior members of the Liberal Party who I'm familiar with, who were a little bit disappointed that Jim didn't do better, not for Labor, but for the country.
Well, absolutely. Now, it's interesting. The ABS recently reported that the income for a typical working household was up 5.2% over the last 12 months. And I'm scratching my head thinking, well, that's, good news, bad news. Sure, incomes may be up a little, but costs are up even more. And it's not equally spread. I love this averaging, which always, of course, gets everybody. The truth is, of course, it's not equally spread. So, a lot of Australians are not actually seeing their incomes rising up in real terms. The costs of living are definitely higher than the official CPI version. And now we've got the RBA thinking, well, maybe interest rates will have to go up rather than down from this point. The markets are certainly betting on that now. And of course, the story is that the economy is overheating. I can smell the burning.
It's rather funny because prior to the release of the recent GDP and inflation figures, Paul Bloxham, who's the chief economist at HSBC Australia, he came out and basically said that the economy is hitting its limit in terms of how much growth it can generate without being inflationary. Now, that's something that's been echoed after the release of the latest GDP figures from people like Shane Oliver or, Chris Richardson, the respected greybeards of Australian economics, even though neither of them has a beard. But anyway, they're both making the point that we effectively have too much money chasing not enough stuff. That's something that, Chris Richardson has emphasized, several times in his articles and on social media. And the problem is that, and this is something that Shane Oliver emphasizes, is that part of the problem is it's stemming from government. A lot of it is stemming from government. So government tends to be a much more price insensitive consumer than the rest of us who are just like, if we, for example, come across something that's a bit too rich for our taste, we go, well, maybe later, or maybe I just won't buy that at all. Whereas government's like, well, I've got to have it.
Absolutely. Well, of course, we'll see a little later in some of the data just how much the government has been spending. But it's worth reflecting on this. I saw the other day, somebody had calculated that 24% of all Aussie dollars have been created in just the last few years. And, if you want to understand why inflation is still raging, guess what? If you print more dollars and those dollars are chasing the same goods and services, guess what happens?
Yeah. Well, exactly. It's basic economics. It's explaining to a primary school age student where inflation comes from in, one of the most simplest ways. Although by the same token, then you've got the members of the Albanese government who just don't seem to believe in the demand part of the supply and demand balance.
Well, of course, economics is only convenient if it actually meshes with your particular way of wanting to talk. And I'm always fascinated, as I said earlier on, about how people are very selective in the data that they actually come out with and are able to explain things in a particular way. And you stand back and think about, well, hang on a moment, what about this stuff over here? What about the landmines over there? Because, we're navigating around these, trying to find a way through to explain the stuff they don't want to explain.
It's a bit like that, and I think the thing is that the data does exist out there. Like say for example, like one of my favorite pieces of data that unfortunately only comes out quarterly is the ABS labor account, which came out today, which again showed that in terms of the number of employed people, that the market sector, which is every aside from public administration and safety, education and training, and healthcare and social assistance, was once again going backwards in terms of the number of people employed in outside of those sectors, but there was strong growth in those sectors. So again, we're seeing government play this defining role in supporting the economy, which is on paper at least good for the economy. But the problem is that you end up with persistent inflation, which leads to higher interest rates. And I think it's just worth exploring that for a moment. Just that if the government does keep supporting the economy, as many suspect that they will, when rate rises do come or rates do stay high, that is going to be quite the imposition on the Albanese government's political fortunes if the opposition or whoever becomes the opposition can get together.
Yes, and it just brings us back to this fundamental principle of crowding out. There is only so much capacity in the economy to do things, for example, construction. And if in fact you've got a lot of government-backed programs that, of course, are often priced in a way that is quite attractive to the contractors who are actually providing it, they're going to spend all of their effort and resources on building those projects rather than, for example, building housing. Or again, if you think about the workforce, if more and more of the workforce are being sucked up into the public sector or the quasi-public sector, that means that there's less available workforce in the private sector. The private sector, of course, is always struggling with its costs and wages and all of those things. One of the reasons why perhaps public sector wages growth tends to be stronger than the private sector. Investment is stronger in the public sector than the private sector. And so you get this warped picture of an economy that is more and more and more limping along thanks to extra government spending and extra government investment. And of course, indirect investment through those sectors that are actually in the private sector but funded directly by the public sector, NDIS, for example. And you look at the economy and you think it's more and more warped, it's more and more unstable. And then, of course, it begs the question, when do you stop? If you stop, what happens? Well, the wheels fall off. But if you then keep pressing your foot to the floor, Burnout Economics 101, you keep pouring more and more money in. That actually creates more and more demand for stuff. That puts more pressure on inflation. That puts more pressure on wages, particularly in the private sector. And so it goes on. And the critical question that we need to understand is, how do you break out of this cycle? And how do you break out of this cycle without effectively losing the election?
Well, I think the thing is the government has a big enough majority and a big enough electoral buffer to pretty much make it to weather that sort of storm. Obviously, they don't want to, if given the option, but there is the scope there, more so than for any other government since, I would say, probably Howard in 1996. Following his election to government. But I think part of the problem that we face in the present is if you, say, for example, stop the expansion of government as a driver of growth in the economy and reverse it back towards more normal historical trends, chances are you're going to get a recession. If you reduce migration back to a level where it is more favorable for productivity growth, where it is better targeted, where it is at a level that's more consistent with the number of homes that we are building and the housing deficit. This is something that Shane Oliver at AMP and the folks at HIA have covered quite nicely. Then also you're going to then face a recession. And I think that it's just worth exploring the migration thing for just a moment, because I think that there's an underappreciated issue there, because you are adding all this additional demand for stuff, to quote Chris Richardson. But the problem is that you are not generally providing additional workers who are capable of providing a lot of that stuff. So, for example, are we importing, heaps of tradesmen, or are we importing a disproportionate number of of healthcare workers above our existing needs created by an aging population? And the answer is no. So what we are effectively doing is importing demand, but we are not importing enough supply to then meet that additional demand because our migration system is not terribly well targeted. So that in and of itself is inflationary, and that in and of itself damages productivity because we are not getting the type of workers that we need at an aggregate level, which is ironically something that the government admits in their own commentary on the migration system.
Yes, and we did get some data through the national accounts, which confirms what we already knew, that migration is on the up, and therefore population growth is on the up. And as we've said before, the difficulty with the migration rising is that the demand lands quickly. If you have homegrown kids, they're coming. You know that you're going to need to build more schools, et cetera, down the track. Whereas, in fact, if everybody suddenly lands in Australia and says, hello, I'm here, well, then you need to actually increase your capacity for housing and transport and health and water and power and everything. But you need it now. And, of course, the capacity to supply that is quite limited. Supply demand, again, puts the price up and makes availability more scarce. And by the way, just to be clear, we are still building way more houses on a sort of relative basis than almost any other country in the world. So it's not like we've stopped building. It's just that we've got too much demand as well.
Indeed. And I think that I think it's just really funny because so much of the commentary in Australia on housing availability, housing affordability is about supply, supply, supply. I mean, that's literally what Phil Lowe said when he was in front of a Senate Estimates Committee, that it was all about supply, supply, supply. I mean, to Lowe's credit, he later mentioned the issue with migration-driven demand, which is something that a lot of people in his position wouldn't touch with a 50-foot pole, but I digress. But I do think that it's just funny that the fact that we do build so many homes, we build more homes per capita than the US, Canada, and Britain, and we have built more homes than them for every single calendar year for 37 years. So that means that the average Australian is 38 years old. Sorry, the median Australian is 38 years old. So that means that in their entire lifetime, Australia has only lost the home building crown in per capita terms once. Yet we are told that the issue is supply. Now, don't get me wrong. Could we be doing better? Absolutely. Have we done better in the past? We certainly have. But we have the constraints of increasingly expensive builds. We have the constraints of a workforce that is increasingly concentrated in the white-collar elements of the construction sector and not at the coalface. But this is yet again another one of those problems that you could address, and you could address tomorrow by changes to regulations, changes to, basically the need for a lot of these white-collar workers who we did without for decades and decades and decades up until, relatively recently. But then what are you going to do with the, let's say you manage to reverse the ratios to say like 1990s levels of the number of white collar to blue collar workers. What are you going to do with the 150,000 people that you just put into unemployment? And that is why reform is hard and why a lot of the time it just goes in the too hard basket.
Yeah, and I just want to do a quick plug. Yesterday, I recorded a show with John Wright, and he was talking specifically about what he calls the carry trade in housing. And he's arguing that, while migration is a really important issue to understand and supply is a really important issue, the real issue is this leverage that you get with the various tax breaks and the investors. And he thinks that the investor problem is probably one of the biggest issues that's actually driving housing policy off the rails. But it's a policy that both governments, both parties of government have basically supported for a long time. The banks, of course, support it, and pretty much everybody else. So the whole structural mechanism of the way the economy works is profoundly influenced and actually driven by this carry trade in property, which means that prices will go on going up. You'll never actually supply enough property to solve the problem because there is a structural issue here, but it's deliberate.
Well, it's funny. Like, if you look at the number of homes, for example, that have been sold in Australia over the last 12 months, I believe it's about 530,000. Now, of that, somewhere around about based on the average of the proportion of new mortgage lending flowing to property investors, somewhere around about 35% of that was bought by property investors. In the last in the last quarter of data, more than 40% of those properties were bought by property investors. So if we do a bit of very, very rough math on that, you're talking about property investors purchasing around about a bit over 210,000 homes a year, on an annualized basis. Now, the numbers from the migrant settlement outcomes data from the ABS suggest that over a period of about a decade, the average migrant intake, this is pre-COVID, so this is not the more outsized intake that we've seen. This is pre-COVID numbers. Unfortunately, we don't have more updated ones. But on those numbers, they add around about demand for about 40,000 homes a year. Now, that doesn't count the number of migrants who then go on to become property investors, who are quite now popular on TikTok and other social media sites. But yeah, so the investor story is a huge, huge part of the equation, because I think the thing is that there's two separate but interacting issues when it comes to housing. There's aggregate supply and demand, which is the number of people and the number of homes. Now, that is basically what ends up setting rental rates. And that's why we saw rents surge so dramatically, both as Australians wanted out of lockdown and we then saw the surge in migration. But then actual house prices are set by the number of homes on the market versus the number of people chasing those homes on the market. So if you've got the number of investors rising in relative, so the proportion of homes being bought by investors rising by, let's say almost 80% compared with where they were in, say, 2017, 2018. But of course, it's going to push up prices because you've got all this additional demand. And this is something that MP Albo, opposition leader Albo, and opposition frontbench Albo very much opposed. He was, we shouldn't be making it easier for people to buy their sixth home instead of their first, and all this sort of stuff. There's a quite good interview with him on Sunrise from, I think it was 2018 or 2019, when he was spruiking that particular line. And funny that he has such a different perspective now that he's Prime Minister. He can actually make a difference.
Indeed. And it really does come back to this issue of, K-shapes and the fact that some are doing fine. And if you've got lots of investment properties, then you're thinking, well, that's great. I need prices to continue to rise. If you're a first-time buyer trying to get into the market, then you've got a whole new ball game. And you've actually got some very powerful slides now, which we're going to move on to, which really brings this out even more. In fact, amusingly, you have this K-shaped economy, which is actually rather appropriate. We're sort of going down the drain and hitting the roof.
Yeah, pretty much, right? I mean, unfortunately, that's how it is for a lot of people. Some people doing very well, a lot of people not doing that well. As usual, the charts are available at burnouteconomics.com. Anyone subscribing on a paid basis would be very, very much appreciated. I'm doing a little bit of a Christmas subscriber drive, so if you want to give me a little bit of a gift to pay for the costs of running this enterprise, that would be very, very much appreciated. So we'll get straight into the slides. Okay, now, recently, Cotality released, formerly known as CoreLogic, released numbers on the price-to-income ratio across a bunch of different Australian housing markets going back to 2006. Now, the thing that I really liked about this data was that it doesn't use the aggregate national median household income. It uses it at a granular level. So for example, we've got here a house in regional New South Wales costs 9.4 times income, but that is the income for regional New South Wales. So it gives you a much, much better idea of how expensive homes are in some of these, technically speaking, less expensive areas than the capitals, but still very expensive relative to incomes. So what I then did is I got curious. I thought, well, how much is that compared to, say, prominent US housing markets? So I went looking. And it turns out that regional Tasmania has a very similar price to income ratio as California. Regional Queensland is more expensive relative to incomes than Miami. And regional New South Wales is roughly on par with the very popular port of Southern California, San Diego. So I just thought that was rather amusing, the fact that, people say, well, you just need to move to the regions to afford a house. Except the regions are now more expensive than some of the most expensive housing markets in the world relative to incomes.
Yeah, and I'll just underscore that's precisely the same finding that I get from my surveys. I talk about the pressure on households, and I keep underscoring it's not just in the capital cities. There are areas across the country. Why? Because the costs of housing have risen significantly relative to incomes. And by the way, out in the regions, of course, the costs for things tend to be higher because guess what? Food tends to be more expensive and transport is more expensive. So when you actually put all the numbers together and think of it not just in housing isolation, but in terms of overall cash flow of a household, what I see in my surveys is a lot of regional areas, including Tasmania, and I see a lot of issues in Tasmania particularly, are there. And, we're in the situation where people are being asked to pay the same sort of ratios as they would in some of the major centres in the US, which just shows how distorted the housing market is in Australia.
It is. And I've got another good slide on this. Now, what this shows, this is also from Cotality's report. What this shows is the proportion of median household income to purchase the median dwelling, assuming that you have a 20% deposit and all the various extra coin for transaction costs. Now, what I've done here is I've compared December 2019 with the latest 2025 data. And I think what makes this such a great chart is it shows how relatively inexpensive, even relative to the incomes in those areas, regional Australia was back in before the pandemic. Whereas today, every single regional area, with the exception of regional WA, which is a photo finish, and the regional Northern Territory, is now more expensive relative to incomes than Sydney was prior to the pandemic. That is how much things have deteriorated. And also there, it also shows the capitals and how much things have deteriorated there relative to incomes. And that's not a pretty picture, particularly for Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth.
And one other quick observation on that, the regional differences and national differences are based on average household income. The thing to look also too is what proportion of households now have multiple incomes, two incomes, relative to perhaps 10 years ago, where perhaps there was one income or one of the bit incomes. Because certainly I see in my surveys, the assumption now is, well, it's always two people plus working in the household trying to actually cover the costs. So it's even more distorted if you were actually thinking about, well, what was the average typical income based on, per household then and now? That's also changed dramatically too.
Well, that's an interesting observation, because I think the thing is that what we've seen over the last, let's just call it since 2019, is we've seen this really interesting evolution of how different demographics are moving, up and down the chain of household incomes and household spending in particular. Like say, for example, like it used to be this idea that consumer spending was defined by people, generally speaking, under the age of 60. And so as people, age, they stop buying extra cars, they stop buying extra clothing, not stopped, but they weren't buying as much of it. But we have arrived at a situation now where the median new car buyer is 55 or older. So we're seeing a much more affluent cohort of retirees and over 60s replace who was previously occupying that demographic space. But that also puts upward pressure on median household incomes. Another thing that puts pressure on upward pressure on median household incomes is the other changes of composition to the population. Say, for example, people getting more educated. People taking on second and third jobs, both of which have, the labor account data today showed again a rise in the number of people taking on second jobs. So there's all these factors conspiring to push up household incomes. Yet in reality, we're not seeing that rise the way that we should, despite the fact that we're seeing much higher employment to population ratios, higher participation rates, more women in the workforce, all of which should be pushing up median household income significantly more, but it's not.
And just to build onto that, of course, with higher incomes, particularly from two rather than one incomes, for example, or multiple jobs, all of those things, it means the banks are able to lend more relative to what they did previously, and still, work within the constraints of any guidance that APRA might be giving, which is pretty loose and at the best of times. Although they've tightened it very slightly. They will be from next February potentially for some types of property. But it does multiply the capacity to borrow. The capacity to borrow increasing drives up home prices. And so once again, you see another set of factors which helps to explain why home prices continue to go higher.
Indeed, and I think that's one of the things that's the most interesting about this is that the Albanese government knows this. They're not idiots. They know that their actions are putting additional pressure on prices. I mean, you've got people like Louis Christopher, one of the most prominent property experts in the country, telling them from before the 5% deposit scheme, the expanded 5% deposit scheme, I should say, was introduced, that it was going to put upward pressure on property prices. And it's a universal thing. I mean, there was also that unfortunate report from, I think it was the Insurers Council of Australia who commissioned it, which basically said that it was going to put 5, 6, 7% increase in property prices, and there are people who are saying it's going to be even higher than that. And I mean, I think in some ways it's rather interesting because I feel like the mask has dropped, at least from the Labor side of government, of federal politics, because you've got Claire O'Neill going on ABC Radio last year to tell the listeners, on Triple J, who tend to be of a younger demographic, that no, we want property prices to rise and we don't want them to fall. And I just find that fascinating because in a lot of ways, it's not just a signal to young people of get stuffed, we're not on your side, but it's a signal to property investors of we're on your side. We want prices to go up. We want things to keep going. And we're not even going to talk to the media to say about that we want moderate price rises even, say 3% or 2% or 4% even. In fact, I have asked Claire O'Neill's office multiple times. I've asked the Prime Minister's office to clarify these numbers, and they didn't respond to the request for comment. Although, to be completely fair, neither did the relevant members of the coalition at the time.
Well, nobody wants to talk about it, right? And I do remind everybody that politicians, on average, have more investment properties per capita than the rest of the population. And maybe that's something to do with it too. Yeah, just suggesting.
Well, it's funny because the argument that's given to me is that, oh, no, we can't say that, it's political kryptonite. If you say that you want housing prices to fall, and it would be the death of leader X or leader Y. But in New Zealand, their housing minister Chris Bishop has been saying that a lot. He's gone quite far. He said that he wants housing prices to eventually fall back to 3 to 5 times household income, and that we need to stop seeing rising property prices as a positive thing, because it's not. And I think that's rather funny because he is now the preferred person out of the New Zealand Nationals to take over when the current Prime Minister Christopher Luxon bows out. And I just find that rather funny because it's like, well, you said that this would kill his career, and it's not, and I just find that rather amusing, because here in Australia, if, it's considered the ultimate in, political ritual suicide.
Exactly right. Yeah. Well, I do think New Zealand is giving us some interesting and important lessons. And, talking to some of my friends and associates over in New Zealand, they're adjusting to the idea that maybe house prices don't have to always continue to rise. And maybe it's a little easier for people to get into the market if prices fall. And rents can also go down, which makes housing less expensive, which means that people feel a little bit better off. And the world hasn't stopped. The sun still shines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting things about New Zealand is that the New Zealand news website Stuff recently did, well, it wasn't recently, it was about a year and a half ago now. They did a poll asking that, this isn't just an online poll of, people who are readers. This is an actual, they hired a polling company to do this. And they asked them, do you care? Basically, they asked the Kiwis, do you care about falling housing prices? And the people who did care, the most were the people who were young and they cared because it made things easier for them. But for a lot of the other people, they're like, no, not really. No, it's not that big of a deal. This doesn't really matter. And because the thing is the other side of the coin that's admittedly rather challenging, which is falling housing turnover rates, is people just aren't transacting. And if they're not transacting and you're only seeing, 4%, 4.5% of properties go under the hammer every year, then why would you care? If you're not going to sell your house for 20 years, why would you care if property prices drop? It doesn't matter to you.
Absolutely right. Well, I've always say to people, the price of one property is the price of one property. If you're buying and selling at a point in time, you're on both sides of the transaction. So unless, to go back to John Wright, unless you're in the carry trade business, which means that you actually have to make more money by seeing property prices go up, actually, it doesn't matter. And that's a really interesting observation.
Indeed. And I think the thing as well is that the RBA, I feel like they only look at one side, or if they don't, even if they do look at both sides, I don't think they adequately look at the other side of the wealth effect, of the idea that rising property prices means higher consumption. But I don't think they adequately factor in the drag that higher housing costs has on consumption. I mean, I don't know how the RBA can really look at let's call it the last 20 years. Right. And this is funny because I actually got some of this data from them. How they can look at the last 20 years and see the fact that young people today are spending less in real terms outside of their housing costs in per capita terms than they were 20 years ago. That to me is just a wild statistic and just should be absolutely emblematic of the RBA and the government's failure to really balance this economy. And instead, because it's all about the wealth effect and because it's all about property, you just see this bifurcation where, sort of people who are generally 55 and over have done relatively well. And then people who are sort of under 45 in particular have done quite poorly. I mean, obviously these are aggregate numbers at the average, but it makes you wonder how things would look, when without some of the more affluent members.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Michelle Bullock was in front of the Senate estimates committee this week. And she was very, very strong that housing prices are nothing to do with the RBA. We just take them as an input, And I'm thinking, oh, that's very interesting because there was some work they did some time ago on the importance of house prices. In fact, Nick McKim really pushed on that quite strongly in some of his questioning. But the Reserve Bank has really washed their hands completely of house prices. Nothing to do with us.
Well, if it's nothing to do with them, then why do they author papers about the wealth effect? Why do they author papers on the impact of monetary policy on housing prices? Because the wealth effect and housing prices are major support acts for their version of 21st century monetary policy, because it doesn't work to boost business investment as a proportion of GDP the way that it used to. It doesn't work properly anymore. So if you've removed that. And not only that, but at a mechanical level, you've now got the fact that this big glut of savings, which you are now removing, as you lower interest rates, you're taking from one side of the ledger and giving to the other. It's much, much less effective in terms of being a direct input to household cash flows than it was before, because you're taking from Peter to pay Paul in a lot of ways. I mean, it's roughly, about 80% of it's a wash. So really, the main tool by which that they affect the economy is by household confidence and the wealth effect and property prices. To be completely honest, that's pretty much empirical fact at this point.
Well, I'm quite amused, and I recall Steve Keen's point here that the banks have no idea about the way the economy works, right? The central banks, because they think it's a wash through, whereas in fact, every time a mortgage is actually written, it's basically new money being created out of thin air. That, of course, can be inflationary. That inflation then translates to higher home prices, but also broader inflation, which then has an impact on what the interest rate setting should be in the country. So whichever way you look at it, there is a very strong causation between the housing market, inflation, economy, and monetary policy. But central banks, and including the RBA, seems to have a myopic view here and just completely miss the, blooming obvious.
I think the thing is that they don't miss it. They know. They're not stupid. I mean, I don't think they're stupid anyway. But I think that their hands are tied by policy, by government that basically says that it doesn't want a free market to behave like a free market because number must go up. I think that's rather funny, the fact that we literally have a government, people talk about, planned economies and all this sort of stuff. But when you have a government that says, no, we don't want prices to fall. We don't want, because falling prices isn't necessarily, as Chris Bishop said in New Zealand, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yes, there's obviously the drag on consumption, but at the end of the day, you get the longer term benefit of not having so many indebted households. One of the things I think is funny is if you look back on, say, census data from, say, call it 20 years ago, right? So from just before when housing prices started to boom. When I say 20 years ago, I'm talking about sort of like 2000 to 2001 census. Back then, it was around about something like 35% of people between the ages of 45 and 54 owned their own home. Once you got into 55 to 64, you're pushing, well up into sort of, almost 2/3 own their own home. So you had this huge cohort of people who could freely spend because they own their house outright. Because as they got older, you want to pay for the grandkids' school fees, you want to go to Queensland, you want to buy a new car, you want to do whatever. You had this affluent class of people who had the ability to spend that they had the ability to take risks or to take time off. These people, volunteered. I remember there was a bunch of them, my school growing up. You had these people, working in op shops, supporting charities, making a contribution to society in a different way. But we don't have that anymore. You increasingly see more and more people having to work well into their 60s to pay off these huge mortgages. And some people are still paying off these mortgages in retirement, as your data that you shared with the ABC earlier in the year illustrated. So I just think that there's just this giant handbrake being placed on parts of the economy, whereas on the other hand, for your older, more affluent demographics, particularly those who are in multiple investment properties, the government's pumping race fuel straight into their tank at the rest of the country's expense.
Yes, I think that's a very important point, and my surveys throw that up in sharp relief. Now, let's move the conversation slightly forward, because, of course, the other big news over the last little while was the employment data. And that's actually moved, in a rather interesting fashion, and perhaps a lot of people didn't quite expect it to move the way it did.
Yeah, the October employment numbers were an interesting one, and this is something that I actually talked about on Twitter before their release, because I spoke to a few retailers who I know through the grapevine, and basically a lot of people were saying that we were going to see early sales this year. that sales were going to be pushed forward from November into October because they're not having the greatest time in the world. Now, this has since been borne out in the household spending data from the ABS, which said that early sales played a major role in the strength of the October figures. But back to the labor market, what we are seeing at the moment is that job ads are no longer tracking the performance of the unemployment rate and broader employment growth. And I think there's a very key reason to this. And basically, it comes down to government. Because government is now the primary driver of employment growth in the sort of 2023 onwards period, job ads are no longer such an important indicator because so much of the employment is stemming from government, because it's no longer sort of what you would consider to be sort of normal free market employment growth. So but by the same token, as long as the government is willing to keep spending, and when I say government, I don't just mean the Albanese government, I mean across the board, is willing to keep spending on expanding taxpayer-funded employment, then they can keep the plate spinning and not have that particular little sort of alligator jaws close.
Yes, and I do think the state's story here is really important to tell too, right? Because it's not just federal government who's spending big. The states are too, but there are consequences. Look at what's happening in Victoria.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think the thing is that there are limits to this. I mean, there's this sort of idea that, oh, well, the government spent big during COVID, the government can keep spending big. But we are very much now starting to see the limits of that. We're seeing, Katie Gallagher, the finance minister, coming out and sending a memo to the various departments that they need to cut their budgets by up to 5%. And then we're also seeing the battle between the states and the Albanese government over hospital funding, where the Albanese government wrote to state health ministers and basically said, well, you guys need to reduce your spending on hospitals. And quite a few of the state health ministers were rather displeased, shall we say, with this, because then they're basically turning around and saying, well, we've got this huge population growth, we've got this aging population, how the hell do you expect us to reduce spending on hospitals? It's just not possible. But yet that is the Albanese government's demand. So I think that there is that risk that we face here, that eventually you've got to pay the Pied Piper and something needs to be cut. And I think it's sad to see that one of the first things on the chopping block is healthcare, because I fear that we are going down the same road as Britain during, from the 2010s onwards, whereby you saw, austerity and budget cuts. But instead of cutting the fat in non-market employment, in government, in, the so-called clangos of and the endless parade of useless talking heads within the public sector and, the paid for by the government private sector, what you saw was policemen being taken off the street to cut costs. The number of firemen being cut, the number of fire stations being cut, firefighting equipment being cut, instead of actually cutting where you could actually cut the fat. They just went for what they could, and that is one of my big concerns for Australia going forward. That instead of cutting where we really need to, where government has got the most bloated, it's going to be cuts where people really need those services most. And I fear that the cuts to the hospitals that the Albanese government is trying to push on the states is just the first shot in that particular little war.
Well, and just to add to that, of course, with higher debt, it means the interest payments on that debt is also higher. And because the RBA is probably not going to be able to cut rates much further, and because of where the bond markets are, the cost of that debt's going to be higher. So that's another impost on the government coffers. And how they're going to square that circle, they're going to have to cut somewhere else. But as you say, the things that they cut are perhaps the things that we actually need, rather than some of the areas where they should be looking to cut, but for policy reasons don't want to cut.
Well, I think that's the issue as well. And I think part of the problem is that they've turned a lot of the commentary and a lot of the debate surrounding some of these policies into political battlegrounds. They've turned so for example, the issue around the NDIS, that is now a political battleground. It's a moral battleground, even though, the sort of grift is legendary and prosecutions are few and far between. It's just something that a lot of people are not willing to touch. And that's one of my concerns with Albo's push for universal childcare coming next year, which is going to be one of his signature legacy policies. That is just going to turn into another bloated NDIS type deal that just ends up being rorted to oblivion. Not necessarily rorted, but just milked to oblivion by less than scrupulous individuals, because we were already seeing a dramatic rise in the cost per child in childcare subsidies as it stands. And if that continues, you give it 5 years, 7 years, you're going to have something that rivals the NDIS at that point. Well, the NDIS as it stands today, God knows what the NDIS looks like in 5 years' time.
Absolutely. And your next slide actually really underscores the momentum with regard to government spending, and specifically the proportion to GDP. And, spot the uptick.
Yeah, this is a funny one, because what you see with a lot of these government spending to GDP charts is that they are of overall government spending. And I don't find that particularly instructive, because if you've got a government that's out there investing loads of money, say back in the 70s and 80s, on upgrades to infrastructure, new hospitals, roads, schools, dams, power, you name it, then that's welcome. That's something that is going to increase productivity. It's something that's going to be beneficial for the nation at a household level. So what I've done here is this is just day-to-day government spending across all levels of government. And as you can see, it was stuck in a relatively tight range between the late 1970s and around about the mid-2010s. And then, admittedly, under the coalition, it took off. And it rose and it rose and it rose. And it continued to rise into the pandemic. Now, that big blow-off at the top there, that is the June quarter of 2020, which is when, peak JobKeeper, the doubling of JobSeeker, you name it, all these various government support policies being enacted. Yet today, just on, today's Friday, today on just a regular Friday, day-to-day governments as a proportion of GDP today is higher than at any other point on record than Q2 and Q3 of 2020, when it was absolute panic stations. Now, I think that's rather funny, because what I did for an article at Burnout Economics a couple of weeks ago was I calculated the expansion in the size of government during different crisis events. So the 1983 recession, the 1990s recession, the GFC, etc. What I found was that at this stage, based on the election of the Albanese government, at this stage in a crisis, the expansion of government today is akin to the 1990s recession. It's larger than the expansion of government during the 1983 recession. So it just goes to show that the stimulus from the government is already here. It's already flowing freely. And if they're going to throw even more money at the economy to support it, to keep the plate spinning, the government may have to get even larger than it already is.
Yes. Well, as we've said earlier on, there's a problem because, of course, the cost of government, as it goes up, takes more and more of the economy, sucks more of the momentum away from other areas, and that creates some significant pressures, but not necessarily good outcomes. But it is a policy setting that unfortunately many governments around the place, the UK is another example, big government there, as well as in Australia. Now, of course, one of the issues in all of this is migration, and you've done some very interesting work on the relatives of migration in Australia and the US.
Yeah, this was an interesting one, because the term mass migration has become a controversial one for reasons I don't really understand, to be completely honest with you. But it has become a controversial one. It's something, you've got members of the coalition saying, well, if we don't have mass migration, got members of Labor saying it, and then you've got other members of the coalition and One Nation saying, yes, we do have mass migration. The problem with mass migration, the term, is that we don't really have a quantifiable number to quantify mass migration. So I wrote to several members of the coalition and of Labor to quantify what mass migration was. If you're saying that mass migration does exist or doesn't exist, what exactly is it? What number can you give? Is it a proportion of the population? Is it a nominal figure? Whatever you'd like, or if you've got an entirely different definition of your own, let me know. I was going to write this up as an article, but unfortunately, again, none of them responded to my request for comment. So what I did this week was I got curious, well, what does constitute mass migration? So I looked into a bunch of academic articles, a bunch of academic journals, various books, and I found that basically that there is a thing called the age of mass migration between 1850 and 1914. Now, this is referenced in, as I said, in academia. It's also referenced in the in the UK National Archives website. So, if people want to have a go at anyone for using the term mass migration, please feel free to go complain to the British government. So, what I did here was I wanted to figure out, well, what is an indicator then of mass migration? And one of the indications that was used was the proportion of population growth stemming from net migration. So what I did is I then had a look at a number of different sources and basically put a bunch of them through an AI model to figure out, well, what was the numbers like? And then I took the numbers which were the highest because it would make Australia look the least laughable. And then people, because the thing is, of course, if I choose the low end, people are going to complain. So I took the ones that towards the upper end. And what you can see here is that the age of mass migration in the US in terms of the proportion of the population growth through migration is actually pretty low compared with just a normal day in Australia. Even back in the days of the Howard government when migration was relatively low in the 1990s. Yet, if you look at where migration has been in the 2020s, which also encompasses 2 years of lockdown and closed borders, well, we're on a different scale to what is called the age of mass migration, which I thought was rather fitting.
And once again, it highlights the significant uptick that we've got and had, and all of the policy issues that follow from that. And of course, one of them is the impact on, well, if you measure GDP per capita, which is one way of measuring the real impact on real households. Are they getting more wealthy or less wealthy? And of course, we had the national accounts this last week, and you've done some work on that too.
I have indeed. US Vice President J.D. Vance was giving the Canadians some shtick about how poorly their economy was performing in per capita terms and how the US was basically, running roughshod over them. So what I did was I got a few questions from people saying, well, where does Australia fit in this particular set of data? So I then redid the graph based on what Vance shared, the same specs. And what it shows is that Australia is roughly on par with the UK in terms of GDP per capita balanced from the start of 2016. Now, Canada's doing even worse, but all three of Australia, Canada, and Britain are well behind where the US is in terms of per capita GDP.
Yes. And I guess that's to be expected, given the economic cycle that we've got, given the huge momentum in the US, particularly through more recently AI, but also the broader economy there. And I do think that the power of the US dollar to be the backstop currency is also part of the story here, right? That's creating a significant wealth effect into the US, been there for some time. But the astonishing thing is that whether you're in the UK or whether you're in Australia, well, things are not great. And again, it comes back to what I see in my surveys. On many measures, people are now worse off than they were a decade ago. And that's partly migration, that's partly the economic settings and all of those things. But there's no intent that I can see to want to change that.
No, and I think it's just worth noting that in this chart that Australia was already underperforming most of the rest of the pack prior to the pandemic. And I think that's just emblematic of where we are at as a nation. Alex Joyner had this good chart the other day of real sales per capita. This is literally just all sales across the economy, and we are lower today than we were in 2006. And that is, I think, what is emblematic in the data that is come from the RBA, from the ABS, that households under 45 have gone backwards in terms of their real spending. And how can you operate an economy when you've got a set of settings where the median person is 38 years old, and which means over half of people are going backwards? And you've only got this very, very small growth engine at the top end, which is mostly affluent, older households. That was something that I thought was quite funny in the labor account data today. One of the biggest growths in total hours worked over the last 12 months is in accommodation and food services. Now, that's definitely, it's not coming generally from the younger demographics, because the CBA data shows them going backwards. So it's, it's coming from, generally speaking, the 65 and over cohort.
Yes, and once again, it highlights two things for me. One is that the economy is not firing very well at all, and that's been a consistent trend for quite some time. The second is that the wealth effect, particularly among older households with assets, is the very reason why the government is now wanting to find ways to tax those assets directly or indirectly to try and actually generate more income back into the economy to be able to support the economy so they can grow the economy bigger, because their settings are not right. So you can see the roundabout cycle of implications. Settings are wrong, and there's no real intent to try to solve them. And as you say, I see it in my surveys too, a lot of younger people are consistently underwater from a cash flow perspective. They're finding it harder and harder and harder. They're having to cut back more and more just to sort of keep things roughly in check, or put more on credit and those sorts of things, and that necessarily is not necessarily good long term. So there is a fundamental question, and I guess, is there a question of political leadership here?
Well, there definitely is. If there was political leadership, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I find it funny, the fact that there's this belief, I think, here in Australia that there are protected classes of people. People, say for example, it's a belief held by, say for example, some property investors. Whether they're right or wrong about that, I'll leave the viewers to decide. But I think part of the problem is that we've basically seen this creep over time, whereby at first it was the very young, it was the sort of 18 to 30s who were really getting crunched. And over time, that's just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. And it's spread to older and older demographics over time. And you've seen this in the CBA data, which I've shared here before, whereby it's got to the point now where everyone under the age of 65 has gone backwards, to some degree since, say, 2022. And you can't run an economy like that. You can't run an economy where people are going backwards in such a way. And not only that, but then you've got the other side of the coin of all these people getting ahead. I think that is going to be one of the really big themes going forward into the next, decade and a half, of just the fact that there are these cohorts of the economy are doing very well. And I think that's the thing too, is the fact that the government has come for the young. They have screwed things up for the young. They've screwed it up using poorly targeted migration. They've screwed it up using high housing costs. And then that has just, sort of fed through the proverbial snake. But I think that's something that the older demographics need to realize, is they're going to come for you too. Because eventually they're not going to be able to afford to keep this up. And eventually they're going to need the money to keep the plate spinning. And it can't come from us, because the young have already been crunched into to such a degree that it would be counterproductive to take it from say, for example, my generation, because it would do more harm than good. But if you're asset rich and you're sitting on all this coin, well, you're a prime target. And you're already starting to see that with some of the changes to aged care funding, with the government demanding a larger slice of people's pie before they can get that support.
Well, it's happening in the UK too. The mansion tax has been announced. So effectively, property valued over a certain amount, they're going to charge an extra chunk of rates, and more expensive property even more so. And of course, we did have the unrealized capital gains debacle, which Chalmers was pushing very hard and then had to backpedal because he got so much opposition to it. But that's a signal of what is likely to happen, because they get desperate to find additional sources of tax. And a lot of that tax relates to assets and the movement of assets or the growth of assets. And if people are sitting on significant amounts of assets and they're not going to actually sell them or buy them or trade them, unrealized asset gain is the only game in town. So it's going to come at some point.
Well, exactly. I mean, maybe it is through the sort of aged care mechanisms, like that they'll take it from there because it's the lowest hanging fruit, from their particular political perspective. And there are these means that exist. And I think the thing is that at the end of the day, it comes down to desperation. If they're desperate enough, they'll take whatever they can get from wherever they can get. And the thing is that, the opposition may sort of kick up a fuss, whoever the opposition is when that particular day comes. But I have a feeling that when they get into government, they're not going to want to give up that particular source of revenue either.
No, well, I think that's exactly right. They're both on the same side of the debate, I think there. And you've done some interesting thinking here about the issue of leadership popularity and what happens. Fascinating research here.
Yeah, this is from the ANU election study, which they put out basically after every election in almost 40 years. And what they do is they poll people on, to what degree do you like a particular leader, whether it be the prime minister at the time or whether it be the opposition leader. And Dutton got the lowest score ever. So I think there is a lesson here, particularly for Labor and for its supporters, for this, because I think that there is two narratives that try to exist in the same space at the same time. One, that the government won the election because they are so just amazing and fantastic and great at managing the economy and everything, and that they are just so amazing that people, why wouldn't you vote for them? And then there's the other narrative of who in their right mind would vote for Dutton, considering the fact that he's Dutton and his team was subpar at best. Their policy platform was written in crayon, and they made more unforced errors than a 12-year-old playing in the Australian Open. So it just doesn't add up. I think the truth is that Dutton was just unquestionably awful, and that really, really weighed on the coalition's performance. And I think, just looking at this from a historical perspective, no first-term opposition leader in Australian history, in Australia's post-war history, has failed to take seats off an incumbent federal government in their federal government's first return to the ballot box. Never has that happened. until Dutton. And not only did he fail to win any seats off the government in net terms, but the government ended up gaining seats, gaining what it was 17 seats. And it just goes to show that he was just an absolutely awful choice of a leader, and that the Liberal Party just had not really a whole lot of idea what they were doing. I mean, there is reports in the AFR, it was either the AFR or the Sydney Morning Herald, that literally like about a week and a bit prior to the election, they still thought they were going to win. You know, and it turns out they got absolutely destroyed.
Yes, well, there was a policy vacuum, a lot of policy flopping around. As you say, I think you're being unkind to kids' drawings when you say it was coloured out in crayon, right? I mean, it was awful. I don't know what they were presenting themselves as. They were unelectable completely, and the reason why Albo got such a big return was not because of the strength of his persona or policies, but there was nothing else. So that's the truth. And of course, we're seeing the consequences of that, I think, now as well. And by the way, in the UK, we had something similar. The Conservative side of politics collapsed completely. Again, no policies, no direction. The drawing was hardly there at all. So we had Keir Starmer coming in. He's now the most unpopular Prime Minister ever. So it's interesting how these swings are happening because, well, people are not stupid. You know, there are very bad policies being created by those in power at the moment, and they're hitting ordinary people, and, well, people are reacting. No surprise. Which, of course, then leads to the big question, well, then, if it's not the major parties, who is it?
There's that. You know what I think is funny? I do wonder if Keir Starmer was able to expand taxpayer-funded employment and expand the size of government by over 2 percentage points worth of GDP, would he be as unpopular as he is, or would he actually be like, well, this guy's not doing too bad? You know, like I do wonder, you know, because Starmer, his hands are tied by decades of poor fiscal policy in the UK. I mean, don't get me wrong, he hasn't done a good job in terms of what he's been handed, but it was a bit of a hospital pass to begin with. Yet Albo has had, you know, the war in Ukraine and raining money from, you know, another commodity boom. And oh, look, all these extra taxpayers, where did they come from? We didn't think that was going to happen, did we? You know, so,
Exactly.
you know, there's all these things at his back that Starmer doesn't have, you know, that Trump doesn't have. And, you know, I do wonder to what degree that would be different if they were willing and able to be able to spend all that additional dough.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming towards the end of the show, but you've got a couple more really interesting slides that really highlight two fascinating things. One is the impact of AI investment, which is happening actually even in Australia.
Indeed. There was a recent article put out by a Harvard professor on the impact of AI on the US economic growth. And he did a bunch of modeling on this, and he basically came to the conclusion that if you take AI and its knock-on effects out of the equation, that the US economy was growing at about 0.1% per year, which is a pretty poor set of numbers. Now, we saw a huge surge in spending on equipment for AI data centers in the latest national accounts. Now, it is worth noting that technically speaking, through the fact that a lot of these were imports, part of that will then drag from the net exports category. But it's important to note that this caused a massive rise in the private investment category. Now, a lot of people are saying, oh, there's this resurgence in the private sector economy. To a degree, perhaps. But once you take this particular element out of the equation, which, as you can see in the brownie yellow graph at the bottom there, once you take that out of the equation, it's a much less impressive private sector resurgence. It is just this investment in data centers. So this is definitely going to be one to watch going forward, because is it going to be a volatile and bumpy ride? And are we going to see like these big, up and down movements in private sector investment as a result of this? Or is it going to be something that's going to be sustained, potentially, acting as a boost to private sector investment, and sort of at the economy's back for a couple of quarters or even a couple of years? It's a very, very big question. And I don't really think that there is a clear answer at this stage, at least not from someone with my particular skill set at this stage anyway.
Well, one quick point. I'm very interested in the concept of depreciation. And the question is, how quickly will you need to depreciate those assets? Because, if they're AI chips, well, how long do they hang on for before they're actually obsolete? And even data centers need to be depreciated. Significant capital expenditure translates into significant depreciation subsequent, or in other words, it allows companies to write down their profits by the amount of the depreciation they're now actually calculating, which means that they can actually end up paying a lot less tax. So actually, what you could end up doing is actually reducing the amount of tax take from the corporate sector later because of significantly enhanced depreciation. So this is not necessarily just a one-way street.
Indeed, and that's particularly true in the US, where they're spending, untold. I mean, they're talking about now, what was that today? I'm not sure if you saw it today, but they're talking about spending $5 trillion on AI capex by 2030.
Yeah.
Yeah, of which they're talking about 1.3 trillion coming from the taxpayer.
Exactly. And that's another factor I think people need to think about. So 2 points just to underscore. The latest numbers on the national accounts in Australia were flattered by this, right? But the spin Jim about, it's all private sector. See, it's all happening. No, this is the reason. Take that out, and the economy is looking pretty sick. And then the second question is the unforeseen consequences. And just to underscore, if you're investing big in data centers, you need power. Problems in Australia. You need water. That's going to be an interesting challenge. And bearing in mind, we've got questions about future supply and demand of both power and water in Australia. It's going to make an interesting conversation when you sort of put another data center down the road and think, I need more power and water, please.
No, well, absolutely. You got the Australian energy market operator coming out saying that we can't close I think it's the biggest coal-fired power station in New South Wales in 2028 because the grid's not ready for it. So it's whatever way you look at it, whether whether you're in favor of net zero or whether you favor a different path, either way you look at it, we've made an absolute mess of this because we haven't committed to one strategy or another. It's just been this sort of wishy-washy, bullcrap, and it's left us in a very vulnerable position.
Goes back to those wonderful coloring pictures, Well, it's a strategy. Well, if you squint, you can just see some vague outlines of a strategy, but really there isn't one. And the last slide, I think today, absolute killer slide here with regard to China and steel.
Yeah, it is, because one of the things that China has done over the years is when their domestic steel demand has been weaker, what they've done is they've exported the excess steel overseas. And then when their domestic demand then refires, then they export less steel. And as you can see that there from the sort of somewhat downturn in sort of 2014, 2015, where steel exports were forced to rise by excess capacity. And now we're starting to see that again. And based on the figures for the year to date, which I've then extrapolated out, we will see export, if trends continue, we will see record Chinese steel exports this year. And the problem going forward for China is that Chinese steel consumption is falling, and it's continuing to fall because first we saw the drop-off in construction for residential homes. That's due to demographics, it's due to prices, it's due to a bunch of different factors, but that's still continuing. But what we're seeing now is as budgets get squeezed, particularly at the local government level, is we're starting to see fixed asset investment fall, which is, infrastructure, etc. And as that falls, we're seeing Chinese steel consumption fall even more than production, which is forcing China to then export that extra capacity, export that extra steel overseas. So as Chinese steel consumption continues to fall, what are they going to do with all this extra capacity? Is the global market going to be able to continue to absorb that extra capacity? Or are we going to start to see pushback from countries protecting their domestic steel industries because they don't want to become reliant on China to supply them with steel on a permanent basis? I mean, I think it's just worth a little bit of context for this. 118 million tons worth of steel makes China's steel export industry the third largest producer of steel on the planet. So it's a very, very significant amount that they need to find a home for. And if steel consumption keeps falling, I think it's falling at the moment at around about somewhere between 4 and 6% per year, depending on the estimate in question. If that keeps happening, how are they going to be able to find a home for all this extra steel when a lot of the countries that need extra steel are busy building their own industries? Say, for example, like India, which is now the second largest producer of steel in the world.
Yeah, and I'll just make an observation. Of course, data centers require a lot of steel. So I wonder whether there's a yin and a yang there somewhere.
Well, to a degree in China, perhaps, but I don't think they need that much steel. not 118 million tons a year anyway.
It'll be a very large data center. Tarric, that was an incredible conversation today. I think we covered a lot of topics, but as I reflect on it, I think we can see that there's an era of stupidity in play at the moment amongst politicians. There's a lot of spinning going on in terms of what they're saying they're doing versus what they are really doing. And we can see that the impact on real ordinary people continues to be, well, rather negative, particularly if you're in the younger set rather than the older set. But there is no intent to change that. So it's going to be more of the same old, I'm afraid, for some time to come, which means bigger governments, bigger taxes, less private sector investment predominantly, unless AI saves us.
Well, what do I say? The beatings will continue until morale improves.
That's a pretty way to finish. Tarric, thank you so much. As always, links and things are below. And I'll look forward to having another chat with you as soon as we can do it.
No worries, mate. Looking forward to it.
Take care. Cheers.